a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time to pour up a glass, pull up a chair as we gather for a bit of discussion here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub. I'm Micah Hankson. Joining me here at the table are Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Fellas, how you doing?
I got to tell you, we've been working on this project for several months now. Finally here on the very first episode of Seven Ages Audio Journal. Couldn't be more happy to be part of it.
It really doesn't feel like our first time doing a podcast, though. In fact, for us, I think this is beginning to feel like a regular thing.
I am super excited to be here. And even though, like you said, this is our first episode, it seems like we've been doing this for a while. All the work, all the miles, but, here we are.
Now, there's been a lot of field work, a lot of road trips, a lot of things going on in the background leading up to this, but kicking things off, again, it's been great. And also right here around the holidays, this inaugural edition of the Seven Ages Audio Journal being recorded in between Christmas and New Year, which is arguably, some would call it the most wonderful time of the year. I would say it's also probably the most mind-numbing and crazy time of the year.
There's no doubt about that. I mean, you've got so much going on. You got the New Year coming up, you got all the traditions. We have an unusually cold New Year coming this year, so it's kind of starting things off for 2018 in a unique way, to say the least.
Yeah, we had that first snow, by the way, already. It came before Christmas. The weather was calling for a dusting. They said it was going to be a couple of inches. Would you believe we got nearly a foot here in Appalachia?
Well, over here in central North Carolina, I was hoping for a little bit of snow, but all we got was wet slush. But hey, you can take what you get, I guess. James, how's it looking down your way?
Down here in sunny Savannah, it's actually been pretty cold, and they called for a little bit maybe of freezing rain here in the next day or two.
So all you can do then is basically hole up and watch the news.
That's what I need to lift my holiday spirits is more news.
Yeah, well, that's why I go and read what's happening in the world of archaeology and paleontology and these kinds of things.
Well, it's been so far, 2017 has been a great year for that. Unfortunately, I think a lot of these stories have been overlooked. Science has really been moving forward this year.
Fellas, a story like that is about some dinosaur eggs that were found in China on Christmas Day. There was some construction work going on. I think they were building a school, and they found a cache of fossilized eggs. They say in perfect condition. It's kind of a miracle that they weren't destroyed because they were using dynamite to blast the rock away during the construction. Apparently in that area of China, that's kind of a common find, what I read on this. And the type of dinosaur that it came from is an egg snatcher, which is a oviraptor. And that's what they call it. That's what they've called it, which is kind of a misnomer, but the dinosaurs didn't really snatch eggs, they don't believe. It was kind of a toothless skull, but it was more like a kind of a beak thing. They think they used it to crush mollusk with. During that time, that area was believed to be very arid and sandy, kind of deserty. So sandstorms would come up and bury these nests. And sometimes these dinosaurs had a very strong parental instinct, and the skeletons of the dinosaurs themselves would be found on top of the nest, fossilized as they were trying to protect their eggs. The age of these eggs is the Cretaceous period, which is the end of the dinosaur era, because at the end of the Cretaceous, or what marked the end of the Cretaceous, it was a huge asteroid strike, was the one that killed the dinosaurs. So at the KT boundary. So that's, they use K as a representative letter for Cretaceous, even though that's spelled with a C. So, they liken in the story to, Jurassic Park, from the movie, which I really like those movies, by the way. I think they're pretty entertaining, and the special effects are great. But most of those animals that are portrayed in the movie during the Jurassic period actually lived in the Cretaceous period. I can see the producers of the movie would want to pick Jurassic because Cretaceous Park doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as Jurassic Park does.
It doesn't quite conjure the same imagery. Cretaceous Park. But, speaking of Jurassic Park-esque discoveries, I saw a quote from a scientist about this story, and she had said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, Jurassic Park could be real. I mean, all we really need is dinosaur blood, of course, being found probably in a mosquito, just like what you see in the very first Jurassic Park film, encased in amber. But she says, essentially, we're getting to the point with genetic science and advancements in this field that eventually it will be possible to bring back to life extinct species like dinosaurs. That could very well be a reality one day, maybe one day soon.
Certainly. And, there was a find recently of a unknown species of tick that was encased in amber that was attached to a dinosaur's feather, which we now know that they had feathers like birds. So if the proper specimen was found, it's not impossible that type of thing could actually be done.
Hey, by the way, you mentioned that they had feathers like birds. Of course, that was some dinosaur species, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we're not talking about, they were all great feathered serpents, the literal Quetzalcoatlus of the ancient world.
Giant deadly turkeys roaming the planet.
It's funny that you mentioned the Chinese find, James, because China seems to really be a hotbed for this type of discovery lately. I know earlier in 2017, they had found out in the Gobi Desert out there in northwestern China, they had discovered somewhere close to 200 pterosaur eggs that were completely fossilized in a very good condition out there in the Gobi. So definitely have to keep an eye on China as we're going into 2018, because as far as paleontology goes, it seems to right now be on the forefront of all the latest discoveries concerning dinosaurs.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things about China's geology lends itself to that kind of thing. The bones and the eggs and all these different things that paleontologists love to find, the environment was just right for those things to be preserved.
Yeah, it's such a unique circumstance where you have a region that is conducive to the formation of fossils and the preservation of these. There are certain areas, I actually spoke to a geologist about this a few years ago, and they were telling me, there are certain regions where, again, geologically and otherwise, it's not conducive to the formation of fossils. And so the thing I always have to question, and the thing that's always on my mind, how many extinct species, due to the environments and the regions in which they thrived, there is no fossil evidence for them. Again, I think that one of the bold suppositions of people, in various disciplines is that we know everything. Whether it's we found everything out there in space or we found everything here on Earth, we know everything about the ancient past. 2017 was a year for that. And I think, a little later in this podcast, we're going to get into some of that discussion about some of these game-changing ancient human history discoveries and how this has really kind of been moving things, not so much moving things forward as I think revising old ideas. But again, as far as fossils go, there is so much about the ancient world that we probably will never know just because of the fact that we haven't found those fossils. It couldn't be that all things that have ever existed on Earth, all different species, all the genera, every different variety of animal or plant that has ever lived, that we will have a wonderfully preserved little fossil that will tell us about that. There's probably so much more that has come and gone that we'll never know about.
Yeah, absolutely. But when we do find something like these pterosaur eggs or these other dinosaur eggs that James has told us about, there's so much insight that can be gleaned from that. So it is, very fortunate sometimes when we find these types of examples that it moves your knowledge forward exponentially. So if you have a place like China who just lends itself to solidified samples like we see here, it only serves to move the discussion forward. I mean, there's so much knowledge that can be gleaned from that. So we'd have to keep an eye out for future discoveries in China.
Absolutely. That reminds me, by the way, when it comes to expert opinions on things like this, the fellas I'm sitting here talking with, of course, are experts in their own disciplines. And, I wanted to start by asking you guys, really, so that folks at home can kind of get to know who we are and what Seven Ages is really about. What got you into this, and what is it that you hope, of course, to bring to the table here in the Crosstime Pub in talking about history and archaeology and science and culture?
Okay, I'm James Waldo. I'm a professional geologist, as you know, and I've always, as long as I can remember, been interested in science and those types of topics. I was really loved dinosaurs when I was a kid, but I have to say that my interest in geology really got started when I was a young man. I was probably 19, 20 years old. I was in the military, and I was stationed up in the Pacific Northwest. And on a weekend camping trip with some of my buddies, we went up into the Cascade Mountains and went to Mount St. Helens. And it was about 10 years or so after the big eruption in 1980. And so the area was still very devastated from that. And it really just blew my mind. It really just left a mark on my being. And ever since then, after that, I just had a great interest in geology, because it was so mind-blowing to me that Earth has processes like that can be so destructive. Of course, most geology is not catastrophic like that, but that's how I got here.
I'm Jason Pentrell, environmental scientist for the Seven Ages team. While environmental science is one of my big passions, really one of the things I'm most interested in is the peopling of America's archaeology, anthropology. Since I was a young child, my mom, my brother used to always take me around to state parks and rivers and creeks where I would, at 7, 8, be looking for artifacts and, want to spend all day out there looking at the forts and just looking at the history. I think it's one of those things, you have some people that later in life, they get interested in it through college or through friends or whatever the case may be. And then there's those of us who just seem to have that attraction to all things historical from a very young age. And I was one of those people. Of course, with movies like Indiana Jones and all those type of things only fueled that interest. After watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, my mom saw me at the kitchen table diligently marking all of the passages in the Bible that talked about the Ark because it was going to be my adulthood goal to go out there and find it. So I was, mapping it out, and of course, pre-internet time. So I was doing the best with what I had at the time, but just little things like that. I always had that deep-seated interest in history and archaeology of all types and from all time periods. But really, the peopling of America is my main focus of interest.
Jason, that's funny as hell what you said about looking for the references to the Ark in the Bible. I thought I was the only person that did that. I saw that movie and I was like, let's break out the Old Testament. I must know everything there is to know about the Ark.
I know. And see, my father being an Episcopal priest, it was very much like that for me too, because again, you watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and you see that relationship between Indy and his dad. My dad was like that. He would make me spell out the Greek alphabet and things when I got in trouble when I was a kid. So it seems like we all kind of have a common history here. And I can tell you, when I was a kid, it was the same thing. Mom and Dad left me at Grandma's house, and they went to see, I think it was Return of the Jedi. And I was so angry at them for going to the theaters without me. And so they'd take me to see, Peter Pan. I didn't like the cartoons, and so they said, okay, it's obvious he has more mature interests. So the very first film that I was taken to the theater and shown was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And obviously that had quite an effect on me too, the search for the Holy Grail, all of that stuff. And it's kind of been with me ever since. My name's Micah Hanks. I am a writer and a researcher. I love history. I love all kinds of things. I love anomalous phenomena in nature. But really, I think my earliest interests really were seeing films like that and thinking, my gosh, there are questions that we have about the ancient past. And even that romanticized version of it that you see in films like Indiana Jones, that is something that gets a lot of people interested in serious archaeological field work. And over the last couple of years, I think that for me, in addition to being a podcaster and a writer and a researcher and having always had interest in these things, meeting the two of you and working more with you guys, James and Jason, has kind of taken me back to that interest, but it's not that romanticized version of it that you see in films that I'm swept up in the passion of. It's, like you said, Jason, understanding who were the first Americans, looking at antiquity, not only, of course, on this continent, but looking elsewhere in the world. Again, I think archaeologically speaking, when many talk about the rise of civilization, the very first thing we think about is places like Egypt and the Middle East and the archaeology of places like that, and ancient Greece too. And I, again, am so fascinated with all of it, which is why it's so cool, of course, that one of the stories, Jason, that you bring to the table this week has to do with ancient Greece. As much as we know about a place like ancient Greece, and as much of the archaeology that remains intact from times of antiquity in a place like that, there are still some incredible things that we have learned about the culture and also the technological development of ancient civilizations. Maybe one of the first one that comes to mind is, of course, the Antikythera mechanism, which was an ancient computer, essentially. I've always been so fascinated with that. And when we've actually been out on the road together, it often comes up in conversation because it's just one of those aspects of the ancient past where we found something that was far more advanced than what we expected, and it gives us a totally new insight into the thinking and the prowess among the people in the ancient world.
Just a few months ago, we completed our first archaeological excavation. I took you guys out there on some private land, and we worked on that, and we definitely saw there for sure that type of work is not exactly what you would expect after watching those Indiana Jones movies back when we were children, right?
No.
One of those things that really does still carry that romanticism, is this discovery off the Greek island of Antikythera. This shipwreck is long been known about since about 1900. It's believed to have sunk somewhere close to the 65 BC. And it really captivates the imagination because it's really showing us that the ability of the Greeks at this time to create on such an intricate level is well beyond anything that we thought previously. It's really similar in size to something about like a mantle clock that you would have sitting on above your fireplace. But recently there's been bits of wood that were found in the fragments, and it's kind of shown that it was probably most likely housed in some type of cabinet or a case, much like a clock would be today. In addition to that, it has a large circular face. It has 7 rotating hands. There appears to be a knob or a handle on the side, which we can assume would be used for winding forward or backward. But after they x-rayed it and now they've CT scanned it, there's all these layers of interlocking gear wheels. It's now understood that it drove those various hands, but rather than hours and minutes like we associate with a normal clock, it seemed to have been displaying celestial time, if you will. There's a hand for the sun, one for the moon, as well as one for each of the 5 planets that were visible to the naked eye at the time. So Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. What we're looking at here is an extremely advanced and well-manufactured device that is well beyond anything that we've previously given them credit for. And so the Antikythera mechanism from that site has gained this sort of romantic following, and rightfully so, and it keeps giving. So Brandon Foley, he's a marine archaeologist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and he described it as, this is a direct quote, "It's like a tractor-trailer truck wrecked on its way to Christie's auction house for fine art." It's just amazing.
Wow.
And just recently, there's been upwards of 50 items that have been found from bronze armrests that they think possibly could have been a part of a throne. But this site just keeps producing magnificent finds. It seems that this ship that sunk was on its way to deliver some very high-end goods to someone of high importance. Because again, these are the type of things that can really advance our knowledge of a given culture, in this case, the Greeks.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible, some of the things that have come just from that shipwreckage alone. And when we look back to the ancient past and consider all of the things that we are learning, again, 2017 was just a really formative year, I think, in terms of those kinds of ancient discoveries. And so when we come back from this break, we're going to be getting into some of those great discoveries that have really changed the way that we think about things. A lot of this has to do with human origins, and that, of course, is going to lead us into the discussion on the other side with Dr. J.M. Adovasio, who I think was truly instrumental in terms of American archaeology and pushing back the time frame on how and when the earliest arrivals occurred. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. 2017 has been such a year for advancements in our understanding of human origins. I mean, guys, I got to be completely honest with you that I've had my mind blown more this year and more often than at any point in the past. And although, I mean, this was really kind of like a landmark year for me personally, I've always loved history like we were talking about here. And, you know, really that being one of the central focuses of this show, history and archaeology and these kind of things that we love in all areas of science. But for this year to have immersed myself in this kind of thing and to really deeply read and study history and archaeology, and for there to be so many advancements, it was almost serendipitous for me.
Yeah. You know, one of the things I've always felt about the history of the human race, as far as we're piecing our history together, is, you know, we're a species with amnesia. We don't know who we are or where we came from and, you know, when it was. And I always feel like as we make these discoveries and science advances and new techniques are invented to study DNA and those types of things, it's almost like we're recovering our memory one piece at a time, and we're slowly putting a puzzle together of who we are and where we came from and which continent we came from. You know, that even now that's in question.
Well, I wonder sometimes, actually, and we're going to get into some of that here, I believe, but I wonder sometimes even about the idea of the multiple gardens of Eden and things like that. This once would have been considered a kind of silly idea. It is no longer considered quite so silly, but I think that at this point in the conversation, we've really got to make that very important and fundamental statement that in the absence of evidence, if you allow speculation to completely take over, this is, I think, really what leads, unfortunately, to a lot of pseudoscientific interpretations of the past. We don't know, we can't see, therefore aliens and things like this. What is so important about this year, in 2017, is that while there have been discoveries that are reshaping the way that we consider human origins, migrations, and also the time scale in terms of when and where it all happened, there is science that is backing this up. And perhaps it has left us with more questions than answers, but there is science that supports these divergent thoughts and these, I think, these progressions of knowledge that are teaching us things about the ancient past that are quite different from what we once thought. For example, sciencenews.org carried one of the many stories about this, and talking about how 2017 had been such a pivotal year for this. I'm going to read briefly from this article. Fossil and genetic studies in 2017, they write, suggested a reason why human origins are so tough to pin down, and they say it's because no clear starting time or location ever existed for our species. The article reads, the first biological stirrings of humankind occurred at a time of evolutionary experimentation in the human genus Homo. Now, Homo sapiens' signature skeletal features emerged piece by piece in different African communities starting around 300,000 years ago, this proposed by previous research. In this scenario, high rounded brain cases, chins, small teeth and faces, and other hallmarks of human anatomy eventually appeared as an integrated package 200 to 100,000 years ago. This picture, however, is gradually changing, and it contrasts with what scientists have often presumed, that Homo sapiens emerged relatively quickly during the latter time period. Fossils clearly qualifying as human date to no more than about 200,000 years ago and are confined to East Africa, but the discoveries reported this year, including fossils from northwestern Africa, point to an earlier evolutionary phase when the human skeletal portrait was still incomplete. And they use a very brilliant analogy in this article, or at very least one that I liked a lot. Like one of Picasso's fragmented cubist portraits, Homo fossils from 300,000 years ago give a vague, provocative impression that someone with a human-like form is present but not in focus. Discoveries in Morocco convinced one research team that direct predecessors of Homo sapiens lived there about 300,000 years ago. Fossils and stone artifacts unearthed at the archaeological site Jebel el Haroud display close links to later Homo sapiens skeletons and tools. Again, this is representative of just one of these discoveries that occurred this year. Another one that just captured my mind was the discovery of Homo naledi, again, an ancient human ancestor, but really one that presumably lived alongside early humans in ancient times. And there are some remarkable features that have been associated with this. Lee Berger, a paleoanthropologist, has really led the way in terms of this discovery, and we have a bit of audio here of him describing the discovery and sort of introducing us to this remarkable new ancient species.
I'm Professor Lee Berger. I'm a research professor in the Evolutionary Studies Institute at the University of Witwatersrand, an explorer in residence at National Geographic. And I'm here to introduce to you a new species of early human ancestor called Homo naledi. Homo naledi was discovered in 2013 by teams here in the Rising Star System in a chamber that we've named the Dinaledi Chamber, or Chamber of Stars. It is the most significant and extensive discovery of early human relatives of fossils ever made on the continent of Africa. More than 1,550 remains, representing more than 15 individuals from infants to babies to toddlers to tweens, teenagers, young adults, and elderly. The species is remarkable. It's got a tiny brain, barely larger than an orange, with small teeth but that are primitive in shape, standing across a relatively tall body, maybe 1.5 meters tall. In the males, at least, females about 1.4, 1.45 meters, skinny, with human-like arms but a ape-like thorax and chest with a very primitive pelvis. The hands are a mix between very, very advanced human-like hands, but the fingers are curved like very, very primitive ancient human ancestors. From mid-thigh down, it looks like a human. Long legs, human-like feet. Really a combination that we've never seen before in the fossil record. And I suppose most surprising, is what they were doing in this chamber. My colleagues and I from around the world have studied these fossils for more than 2 years, studied their context, and we've come to the conclusion that this species of non-human hominin was deliberately disposing of its dead, taking the dangerous journey into this deep chamber to place its dead or drop its dead into a place inaccessible by any other. Something that prior to this we thought was unique to humans and in fact maybe identified us. Now it doesn't.
He is so fun to listen to and to watch. He is one of these extremely well-spoken people, and I think that that's such a wonderful quality for an educator to have. If you go online and you watch videos of Lee Berger describing these things in the interviews, again, he's really, I think, well-spoken. And it's wonderful when you actually have somebody who is at again, the crux of this kind of a discovery, and he's also able to communicate in a passionate way the importance of what we're talking about. But also, really briefly, I'll add that Homo naledi were burying their dead in this cave. I guess that there are a lot of questions that could be asked about that. Was this for purposes of sanitation? Was this for some religious or ceremonial significance? I think that there are probably still some questions about that, but I mean, it's definitely been something on my mind because these ancient, presumably more primitive ancestors, they behaved an awful lot like humans, and they seemed to have a lot more rudiments, I think, of culture than we would ever have expected for a hominin from that period.
Yeah, that really is very interesting that they'd put their dead in the cave like that. And I'm a geologist, but I'm also a retired Army engineer, so I think practically about things sometimes. And what is the reason for that? Was it ceremonial, or was it to keep the predators or the scavengers away from the remains of their loved ones? Who knows?
That's also a good point too, again, which wouldn't necessarily have to do with sanitation, but nonetheless there was a significance, a practical significance at very least to those burials.
And the fact that you had all age ranges represented there, from the oldest people who were at the end of their life cycle to even the youngest and everything in between, rather than finding just an isolated body, and then that opens up more questions along this line, but to have representations of all age ranges located in that one cave system, I think is pretty remarkable, because you can see Lee Berger's excitement about it, because he knows and realizes just how rare an opportunity like that is to have all representations of all age ranges in one centralized location. So I definitely want to follow that research a little bit more into 2018, and maybe even have Lee Berger on the show at some point in the future.
Yeah, we could probably reach out to him. But again, this is once again one of these discoveries. There were several that occurred this year. Jason, I know that there was another that relates to the Mediterranean, which once again is not only pushing back the time frame on humans and questions about migrations, but perhaps also points of origin as well.
Yeah, now this one was initially released back in the spring, and of course it's highly controversial because what they've seemed to have found here is two ape-like creatures who had human-like teeth, but these were located in Greece and the other in Bulgaria. And right now they're dating these two back to 7.2 million years ago. Essentially what we have here is Professor Nikolai Spazov. Now he's from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. To quote him directly from the journal entry, this new species, Dracopithecus freibergi, is not an ape. It is a member of the tribe of hominins and the direct ancestor of Homo. Now, of course, these findings don't escape without some skepticism. Retired anthropologist and author Dr. Peter Andrews, in replying to this statement, says that it is possible that the human lineage originated in Europe, but very substantial fossil evidence places the origin in Africa, including several partial skeletons and skulls. He goes on to say that I would be hesitant using a single character from an isolated fossil to set against the evidence from Africa. So the evidence is scant. However, I think it's important that it be further investigated, because if it is sort of pushing the human origins back even further, that's vitally important information for us to know.
One of the things that comes to mind when I hear that 7.2 million year old date, other than golly gee, is, maybe there's just on the skeptical side, is maybe there's an error in the dating technique that they used to give that ancient date. So I guess that's really all I had to add to that. But sometimes when I mean,
7.2 really isn't that much further back. It's just, a 200,000 year discrepancy. But I think the real story here is being that these particular fossil specimens being found in the Mediterranean region rather than on the African continent, where we've come to expect these type of finds.
Okay, well, I got to ask you guys then. The Cerruti Mastodon site, that was another one that came out this year. The discovery actually, again, is from much earlier, but the science paper that was published this year in relation to what appear to be, mammoth bones that were scored and worked with tools, presumably by human hands, in a way that only human hands could have done, but 130,000 years old and in Southern California. Now, this, again, part of the reason this was so controversial is because not only that it pushes back that time frame on possible human habitation in the North America, or anywhere in the Americas, but again, on the North American continent in this case, it pushes it back so much further, but also it lays the question on the table, could it have been a Neanderthal that did this? Could Neanderthal have once traveled to the North American continent? Understandably, the scientific community is extremely skeptical of this, but if the science proves and continues in the coming years to be validated, and if there are similar finds in that area, and it is, again, no longer a consideration, but it is a provable fact that there was someone, an early human ancestor or modern humans that arrived on the North American continent at a much earlier time. Again, talk about a game changer. But how do you guys feel about the Cerruti Mastodon site? We haven't really talked about it all that much. I'd like to get your opinions.
No, you're right. We haven't really talked about it at all, really, off the air or on the air. But I would say it's not impossible. Human beings and Neanderthals existed during that time. They've obviously made their way to North America in the distant past. And who's to say that there wasn't other earlier waves that came over?
Yeah, I think that's the key point right there. It's not impossible, but is it likely?
Well, every year we continue to widen our knowledge of ancient travel. While most of our research up to this point has dealt a lot with the pre-Clovis, this goes way beyond anything that we would even consider to be pre-Clovis. We may be literally looking at something that's pre-Homo sapien. So as far as the Cerruti site goes, I want to see what else is able to be produced from the site, if anything, and also further research on what has been recovered to this point. I'm open-minded about it, but again, with something that monumental, I do want to see a bit more research before I kind of give my final thoughts on what that actually may be.
Yeah, which is exactly what happened with the whole Clovis versus pre-Clovis thing. Now, just in case anyone out there isn't up to speed on this, let's talk a little about that for a moment. Again, Clovis culture in reference to actually the stone tools used by what was once believed to have been the earliest arrivals on the North American continent. The type site for this, in other words, the archaeological location that we associated with, and thereby the name is derived. It's Clovis, New Mexico. Blackwater Draw was the actual area where back in the early part of the last century, excavations there determined without question that, again, there were hunter-gatherers, that they used a particular kind of fluted stone lithic point to hunt megafaunal species that existed at that time. And of course, yes, we had Ice Age man in the Americas, and even earlier than the previous discoveries at Folsom, New Mexico. So the Clovis First hypothesis was simply that this culture identified by this stone implement, these tools, the Clovis culture as we called them, the theory was that they were the first to arrive on the North American continent. But that discussion, again, began to change probably as early as the 1970s and 80s, into the 90s and the early 2000s. It became irrefutable that there were people here that arrived prior to what we identify as the Clovis culture, and hence pre-Clovis is now the new norm. And there was a very real paradigm shift that occurred in archaeology when we began to realize that, thanks to sites like Monte Verde, Chile, and one that we're going to talk about here in a moment, the Meadowcroft Rockshelter in Pennsylvania, there was good scientific evidence, geologically and archaeologically, for people who arrived before Clovis. Now, of course, the Seven Ages team, the three of us, we traveled this past October to Pennsylvania. We went to Washington County. We visited the Meadowcroft Rockshelter. And maybe, Jason, you can give us a little bit of a background about what the Meadowcroft Rockshelter is that we visited, and, of course, who we met while we were there.
Well, the Meadowcroft Rockshelter is a world-renowned site. And, first let me begin by saying that not only is the Meadowcroft Rockshelter a beautiful example of proper archaeology and excavation with extremely detailed attention given to the entire process, but it's also a great example of preservation of a site. The way that they have built the structure around this site so that it's preserved for future generations is highly admirable, and I think it serves as a perfect example of what can be done with an archaeological site as far as preserving it for future generations. But what we have there is a site that was headed up by Dr. James Adovasio, who we will be speaking with in the next segment. He was kind enough to give us not only a tour and lecture, but also a very in-depth interview pertaining to the Meadowcroft site. What we find at Meadowcroft is a well-stratified site, very, very deep within this overhang ledge that's right off of Cross Creek, which is a tributary creek into the Ohio River. So this rock shelter would have been utilized by people, and there were pre-Clovis implements and with huge implications such as the Miller Lancelet that was found there at the rock shelter, which kind of became a focal point for some of the pre-Clovis ideas about that particular region.
It's just such an interesting place, too. When you go there, not only is the countryside beautiful, but, the three of us driving out there that day, I almost felt like I was in another country. Those rolling hills of Pennsylvania reminded me almost of, parts of the UK. And we get out there to this site, and of course we were treated to this wonderful lecture by Dr. James Adovasio, who, beginning in 1973, was using the site as a archaeological field school. And of course, during the interview that he gave, he talked about this in depth and the significance of not so much the discoveries there, but its importance as a field school. That's what they intended it to be. It just so happens that they also found irrefutable evidence of earlier arrivals than Clovis. But, James, when we got there, and you being the team geologist, I'm not even a professional geologist like you, but it is almost, I would say, it is awe-inspiring. Just looking at the geology, looking at this great, it's a reentrant, right? Is the term, is that correct? When you have that kind of a rock overhang like that that's weathered, the erosion has occurred, and the more erosive rock is below a less erosive feature on top, and hence it weathers out over time. Wind and water kind of wears it out, and so it's not quite a cave, but you've got this great big reentrant, and it's just this beautiful, huge rock overhang.
Yeah, it's a product of what's called differential weathering. It's basically where you have one rock that's more resistant than another that overlies the less resistant rock, and it weathers away from water, mostly water and freezing and thawing action. But the thing that I was struck with was the age of the site. But that type of rock formation, a rock shelter, they're very common, especially in that type of rock, that Pennsylvanian age rock. It's sandstone and shale beds alternating, and it's these very thick sequences, and these types of rocks occur all through the United States and along the East Coast and down through the South. And the first thing I thought was, how many more Meadowcrofts are out there? I've done a lot of backpacking. I spent a lot of time out in the woods, and I've seen thousands of these rock shelters like this. And I realized, holy crap, there could be thousands of these rock shelters.
And another site that comes to mind here, which Jason, you and I have been fascinated with for a long time, is the Topper site in Allendale County, South Carolina. Again, our friend Dr. Albert Goodyear, who carried out those excavations at that location, he did something very novel at the time that others hadn't done, and this was really kind of before that pre-Clovis thing had caught on. He dug down below the Clovis layers. What a novel concept. This is also what happened at Meadowcroft Rockshelter, but like you say, James, with the prevalence of these kinds of geological conditions that would create an overhang and thus a natural shelter above a floodplain that would have been visited by people over thousands of years, like Meadowcroft was. And again, as we're about to hear, this site was used off and on, but continuously for thousands of years, going back at least 16,000 years. Although there is some evidence that may be suggestive of earlier times, but that, again, looking at things conservatively, 16,000 years is well in advance of Clovis, at very least 2,000 years. But it comes back around to that question, how many more Meadowcrofts could there be? And are there sites like Topper or Meadowcroft that if people were to dig at all, let alone dig down below the Clovis layer, how much further back would these kind of evidences of occupation go? And is there perhaps evidence of things even earlier than that, earlier than Meadowcroft's?
Cerruti is the first step in moving toward deep antiquity. Again, very important site. And I think what was done at Topper by Dr. Goodyear of just simply going deeper than what's expected of you. Many people hit that Clovis later and they say, well, there's no point in going any deeper because Clovis was first. But we know better than that now. We know that pre-Clovis does exist. I don't really even think that's disputed any longer at this point. So, if there's a hashtag for there, it's hashtag dig deeper.
Hashtag dig deeper. That's going to become our rally cry. And it's exactly what J.M. Adovasio did. He received his undergraduate degree in anthropology from the University of Arizona in 1965 and his PhD in anthropology from the University of Utah in 1970. And according to the Archaeological Institute of America, since that time, he has served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution and as professor and chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, in 1990, he moved to Erie, Pennsylvania, to assume the positions of chairman of the Department of Anthropology and Archaeology and director of Mercyhurst Archaeological Institute, where he served until 2015, and was also appointed provost, senior counselor to the president, and dean of the Zurn School of Natural Sciences and Mathematics. He's currently director of archaeology at the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute, Florida Atlantic University. We caught up with him when he was in Pennsylvania. We spoke with him at the Meadowcroft Rockshelter. No better place to talk to the man who was largely responsible for the excavations and the groundbreaking, no pun intended, discoveries that were made there. In a moment, we'll be featuring audio where we sat down with J.M. Adovasio and talked about the monumental discoveries there at Meadowcroft Rockshelter. Be sure also to check out 7ages.org, our website, where you can find articles and video. You'll find a link to our YouTube channel there where a complete video of this interview is available online. So 7ages.org. You'll also find links to our social media accounts, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and other ways you can follow us and interact with us online. More in a moment when we return with Dr. J.M. Adovasio here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. On October 15th, 2017, the 7 Ages research team sat down with Dr. James Adovasio at the Meadowcroft Rockshelter. We had the chance to talk with him not only about his excavations there on site, but also his other contributions to archaeology and his current work at places like Vero Beach, Florida, and also the history of humankind in North America. We feature audio from that interview now with J.M. Adovasio here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
You obviously came into this field for some reason. Was there any definitive experience in your childhood? Was there any one thing that drove you and pushed you to be an archaeologist?
My mother basically programmed me to do this. I mean, she was a multi-major scholar at Marietta College, among whose majors was history. And so I learned to read with paleontology, geology, and archaeology books, and knew by the time I was in the 6th grade that I was going to go to the University of Arizona. So I never wanted to do anything else, nor, for that matter, would I have ever wanted to or been allowed to.
Well, I think you made her proud.
Yeah, I hope that's the case.
I'm sure.
Yeah, I would say so.
Meadowcroft Rockshelter in Pennsylvania, one of the most archaeologically significant sites in North America. State-of-the-art work that was being done there. What is the antiquity that we're looking at on the far ranges, radiocarbon, stratigraphic, and otherwise?
We think people arrive at this location initially about 16,000 radiocarbon years ago, or 14,000 radiocarbon years BCE, thereabouts. Calibrated, you end up with various calibrations for that. So I'd rather continue using just the radiocarbon years.
Right. And conservatively speaking, of course, that's the furthest that we're going. But there were some questions also about cultural associations, maybe with charcoal, that could have gone further back? And I know that you've had some back and forth with some members of the archaeological community about that.
We have a few bits and pieces of things that have produced earlier midpoint dates, but the plus or minus on those is so high that when you subtract it, it ends up around 16 anyway.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why we've taken the conservative approach instead of the deeper approach.
It's always best in science, I definitely think. With the similar discoveries at Monte Verde, I'm interested in, Tom Dillahay, of course, and
Yeah.
how does the discovery of and the excavation of Monte Verde contrast with what's been done at the Meadowcroft Rockshelter?
Well, of course, it's an open site that was excavated like an open site. It wasn't in a building. He couldn't control a lot of the excavation parameters we could control. He certainly expended a tremendous amount of effort in the precision of the excavations. So I think from the idea of being as resolute and getting as much probative data as you can, we had very similar strategic approaches. Tactically, because of the circumstances at both sites, it was obviously different. And then the material remains, of course, are different.
Yeah. The Miller Lancelet really has captured the imagination of so many people. Discovered here at Meadowcroft Rockshelter, it has distinct similarity to other what are believed to be Miller Complex discoveries in this area. In Strangers in a New Land, you talk about the similarity it has to Eurasian samples and the distinct dissimilarity to Clovis. So what is it most similar to, and what does it mean?
Well, I think it's not the Miller's relationship necessarily to Eurasiatic stuff. It's that small blade assemblage and those polyhedral blade cores that look like things that you see in northern China and Manchuria. The unfluted, flat-based or slightly concave projectile point model, so to speak, you can track all the way across Asia. It's just the addition of the flutes over here that makes it so uniquely Clovis. I don't think, unless, as Jennings used to say, the Bering Strait's doorway swings both ways. I don't think unless you carried fluting technology back across that they ever did it over there. So in terms of the overall shape, you have certain similarities, but the degree of congruence, say, between the Miller from here, the stuff that Dunbar calls Miller-like in Florida, the stuff that Mike Collins says is Miller-like in Texas, is much greater in terms of congruence than the Miller is to any particular Eurasian point.
Right.
So the story of the Vero Beach dig can be traced back to over a century ago when the Indian River Farms Company was dredging a canal. At the time, the town of Vero Beach didn't even exist, but this is back in 1913. The dredging turned up various old bones, artifacts of all sorts, which ended up drawing the attention of state geologist Elias Sellards. He excavated there at that site for the next couple of years, turning up more and more evidence of it being an ancient human habitation site. Dr. Adovasio eventually began working on the site at a much later date and was able to go back and find some of the original Sellards dig sites and expand that, finding more important cordage and materials that were able to be dated back, thus creating a new generation for the Vero site and bringing in new technology and excavation that had never been implemented on the site previously.
So in this segment, what we're going to hear from Dr. Adovasio is Jason asking him about that and whether similar procedures were carried out at this, again, almost century-old Vero Beach site with the new archaeology that's being done there and how that relates to what he had done previously, Dr. Adovasio, at Meadowcroft.
So, Dr. Adovasio, moving south, again, we see that you're working on this Vero Beach project. Is the same type of approach to excavation being presented at the Vero Beach site the same way you did it here?
Well, as you're aware, back in Sellard's original work 100 years ago, the critique that was raised about it essentially devolved around the resolution of his data. And Hrdlicka and others said, you missed X or you missed Y or you missed Z or you couldn't demonstrate context or you couldn't demonstrate association. What we wanted to do from the outset, no matter what we found, was to do it as precisely as humanly possible, given the current state of the art. And since we had plenty of experience doing that, not just at Meadowcroft, but dozens of other sites where we've worked in the past, we decided to do the Vero thing as resolutely as possible for now, for 2017 or 2014 when we started, no matter what it turned out telling us about the place. In other words, we weren't trying to demonstrate that Sellards was right or he was wrong. We wanted to demonstrate to anyone's satisfaction who wanted to look at the data that the data says this or it says that. You know, what it said, we could care less.
Right. So you just wanted to make sure you did it that way, capture it. So, I mean, there's been some really interesting finds from the Vero, including, you know, the cordage, which was found that was removed in block now.
Right.
Has anything else been
Well, we have a couple of pieces of fabric that are burnt, otherwise they would have never been preserved, that have come out of the disturbed overburden that we think might have been, when they dug the canal, cut out of one of the archaic levels at the site and dumped on top of the surface that Sellards used to work on. In other words, such things as we found in the overburden of whatever age they turn out to be. We also have, for instance, you know, this is kind of funny, but the oldest dated cow bone from Florida, domestic cow, it may have actually been one of DeSoto's cows. But I mean, the fact that the overburden has stuff of all ages in it, and some of it is Pleistocene fauna that came out of the dredging of the canal, some of it came from scraping the walls. So these additional textiles that we have found are probably Middle Archaic, and they look remarkably like the stuff from Wendover.
right?
And I wouldn't be surprised ultimately if they turned out to be that kind of thing, accompaniments to human interments.
So you're coming up on what's dig season 4, is that correct?
We're done. Our funding extended for the excavation through last May, and now the funding that remains is being used to generate the final report. So that's what I've been working on, except today, obviously, for the last couple of months.
Okay. So is that going to be it for the Vero site?
What we're doing now is looking for other localities in the general area that Sellards identified 100 years ago that he thought were potential locations for either Pleistocene fauna and or late Ice Age artifactual material, or both. So we're in the midst now of trying to figure out where to dig next.
Also, a discovery found there at Vero Beach was a rather controversial one, and there's a lot of dispute about the veracity of this particular artifact, but what it is claimed to be by its discoverer is a carving, presumably by one of the earliest inhabitants in America, of a mammoth inscribed in a piece of fossil mammoth bone. And so the implication here is that if authentic, it is perhaps the earliest representation of art found in the New World. But the problem is, of course, we don't know necessarily whether it's authentic or not. We asked Dr. Adovasio his thoughts about this.
With regard to art, one of the issues we find with Meadowcroft Rockshelter, of course, is that the changing features over time and the erosion, we don't have a whole lot of representation of Clovis-era art. No. There is the piece of mammoth bone with the etching recovered from Vero Beach also. Do you have feelings about that and what that may represent?
You know what's interesting about it? I have never personally seen it or a cast of it.
Oh, really?
I do know the guy who allegedly found it, who is remarkably vague about precisely where it comes from. And my colleague Andy Hemmings, who's cited in that article, has seen and handled the original, and he's absolutely convinced it's a fake.
Oh, really?
But other people that you guys know, like Barbara Purdy, is convinced it's real. So I have no personal opinion about it. It looks like the kind of thing that somebody at that time might have done. Did they do that piece? I don't know. The guy who found it is an interesting character.
Right.
I don't know if you've met him or talked to him.
I've never met him personally, but I'm very familiar with the story of, it was under my kitchen sink, and then I pulled it out one day and saw that, the whole story was...
You tend to wonder when the face of the discoverer is exhibited in local hospitals and it says, "Do not give anything to this man." I mean, he is not knowledgeable, the guy. I mean, but he's out there.
It seems to be something, there's almost like an intuition you kind of pick up on.
Okay, so obviously you have more experience than anyone in the field when it comes to basketry, cordage, those type of materials, lifelong experience. During your presentation, you certainly seem to have a desire to represent equally both the male and female roles of the indigenous people of this country. Is that due to your experience with those types of materials, or is it just something that you've kind of always felt?
No, I think that because we have been in a male-dominated field since the 1830s, because literally all of the geologists at that time, all of the would-be avocational archaeologists were men, we've had a very powerful bias to interpreting the archaeological record in male terms. And I think, well, for instance, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Arizona in '62, there were almost as many undergraduate anthropology majors as there are now. There were like 500 of them.
Right.
One woman.
Oh.
One. Who actually happened to be black. So it's even more remarkable. But in any case, now if you go to any institution, anyone that anthropology is taught in, or even geology nowadays, the representation of females is always greater than 50%. And that's bound to have a difference. It's bound to make a difference. I think if you look objectively at the archaeological record, you look at the ethnographic record, and you have to conclude that most of what hunter-gatherers make is non-durable.
Right.
It's well, look at ourselves now. The eyelets of your boots, a watch if you have one in your pocket, your pen, your buttons. I mean, you have almost no durable stuff at all.
Right.
And it's all of us are wearing perishable items, and had we been alive then, everything we're wearing would be natural plant fiber, natural this, natural that, and the likelihood would have been that all of our stuff, just like the factories that made our shirts now are mainly staffed with females,
Right.
that our shirts or whatever passed for them at the time would have been made by women. And when you recall all that, and you're looking at an archaeological site, and you recall things like we did all the fabrics from Windover, we analyzed them. In that whole 170 odd burials, all the stone tools from that site that they thought were important enough to take to the next life with you fit in your hand.
Yeah.
But a huge number of them had fancy fabrics and all that stuff. All the burials of women had awls and needles and all kinds of stuff like that. So I think you can get support for the importance of those technologies, both directly from the archaeological data and indirectly. Did I ever think about it much before the Dark Lord made me think about it? Probably not.
Right.
But he didn't leave you a lot of room. I mean, he was
Pretty stern on that.
way.
Well, I mean, a thought that I've often had too, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, is some of the finest flint knapping that you see. As I'm out looking and finding artifacts, sometimes I've stopped and thought, I wonder if this detail and this finesse that you see in some of these lithics was actually created by a female hand.
Well, I think you can get fair representations ethnographically of females working stone for certain purposes. I don't know, I'm not that familiar with the data to know if any of those ethnographically attested to incidences of females making stone tools involves fine work or not. I just don't know.
Right.
But I would not be at all surprised that there are circumstances and occasions where they could and probably did do that because of the fineness of some of the non-stone stuff that they do. Some of those awls, some of that string, some of those chords they're phenomenally complicated.
Right.
It requires an incredible level of hand-eye coordination and whatever that, not saying guys couldn't have made them and probably did occasionally, but I don't have any problem imagining females doing it.
Right.
Burning question, one of the biggest issues I think that we see in archaeology, there is a divide, this discontinuity between the collector, the avocationalist, and the archaeologist. We see people on forums online who say, if you find anything, don't tell the archaeologists, don't let the government-sponsored guys, they'll come in and take all your stuff. How can the archaeological community communicate more effectively to the collectors that we need to work together because this information needs to be collected, studied, and preserved?
You probably have dealt with archaeologists who want nothing to do with avocational archaeologists. They simply have that kind of that flavor of academic arrogance that only some obnoxious PhD can have, and they're not redeemable. By the same token, you find others who have, from the beginning of their careers, dealt with non-professionals productively, whether it's somebody like Dale Crow's working in the Pacific Northwest with Native Americans, whose insights into some of the wet sites he's digging have been very informative, or you have people who take insights from amateurs on a very regular basis because they find that the non-professionals simply have more field experience in their own backyard than you do as a stranger. And I think to automatically rule out any source of information is insane. I mean, by the same token, to convince an amateur who has been badly treated that he ought to interface with you is a whole nother thing altogether.
So what advice would you give to an avocationalist who is passionate, who wants to do the right thing, and just maybe doesn't know the proper way to go about it?
Well, I think one needs to find one of the sympathetic archaeology or geoarchaeology types that likes and has worked with avocational sorts, or that can be introduced to such a person because of their participation previously in a professional project. I mean, Al has hundreds of volunteers that have worked at Topper. They in turn know hundreds more folk who are avocationalists and can act as an introduction to Al and or his people. And the same is true all over the country. There are sympathetic folks just as there are hyper unsympathetic folks. And like I said, I think to rule out, we were, just as an example, we were doing archaeological survey on the island of Cyprus, western Cyprus, in the late 60s and early 70s. And we got some of the best insights into the locations of sites from local Turkish-speaking and Greek-speaking shepherds who knew where the sites were. But many of our professional colleagues wouldn't even talk to these guys because they were shepherds. Jennings used to tell us when we were working, I worked in that part of Nevada that borders on Arizona, where there are a whole host of very remote canyons and so forth, many of which to this day are peopled by minority Mormon polygamous communities. And they know the local countryside like the back of their hand. They've lived there for 150 years, and they're not uninformed about Native American sites or anything else. To not tap that really unusual resource to understand where sites might be of some time period would be insane. Similarly, in a lot of those small Nevada towns, the general store doubles as a saloon and a one-night stand house of prostitution. To not talk to those folk who know the landscape, or at least can introduce you to a miner or somebody that knows the landscape, is crazy. And yet you'll have archaeologists that won't do any of that stuff.
Even though we know cases like George McJunkin, it's not always the professional who finds these things. In fact, it rarely is.
Most of the time, these Paleo-Indians, I don't know enough about the history of Topper to know how Al found out about it. Frankly, I don't know that. I know that Tom Dillahay found out about Monte Verde from a woodcutter. I know that I found out about this from a historian who knew Albert Miller. I think most of the really spectacular, recently excavated sites were discovered by non-professionals. I think if you look around the world, that's got to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, by a construction crew, or by, someone running a pipeline, or whatever.
All through, yeah.
Now, perhaps there's no archaeological site discovered in recent years that has captured the imagination of people all around the world like that of Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia, Turkey. This site, of course, dates back to a time coinciding with hunter-gatherers here on the North American continent, the Clovis, and, of course, those who followed them. But what we find with Göbekli Tepe that's so remarkable is not only a group of hunter-gatherers in Paleolithic Turkey, but also a group of hunter-gatherers who are doing what we never expected them to do, building what appears to be some sort of a ritual site. There was also evidence of grain storage there. This is significant because there appears to be ritual importance to the site. It seems to have been buried intentionally thereafter, and all this prior to the advent of agriculture in that region or anywhere else in the world. Now, of course, while it's not related necessarily to North American Paleo-Indian studies, its significance in broad terms is without question, and so we asked Dr. Adovasio his thoughts on Göbekli Tepe.
Okay, so the site in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, everything seems to be pointing to it being of the time of hunter-gatherers, right at that margin. Just in general, what are your thoughts on that site, and what does it mean to the research in the United States?
I think we North American archaeologists, whether it's U.S. or Canadian, have tended to underestimate the complexity that's possible to encounter in hunting-gathering societies. And so to find a place that seems to amply attest to not only complicated architecture, but presumably some kind of socio-religious or sociological practices that represent much greater complexity than we're willing to talk about is typical. I mean, in other words, we seem, despite being immersed in ethnographic data that should tell us otherwise, we seem to be still willing to ignore vast chunks of what we understand to be the case or should understand to be the case. I think and I don't think that's unique to this field. I think my first job, so to speak, at Arizona, I was a TA in a geology class. And the guy who taught the class did not believe that continents moved. I mean, he was not a Wegener disciple of any sort. And he was like, okay. And this is, 70 years later, 60 years later. So I'm sure that's the case for auto mechanics or anybody else that finds themselves in a circumstance where the received wisdom, whatever it is, about anything is different than what they were raised with.
That seems to be the case. It's there, but it's disregarded because it doesn't fit into a particular narrative.
It does. Yeah, it's exactly right. It can't be right because I never learned that it was right.
Right. So thinking along those same lines, I mean, because every year there's more research coming out. There's recently been the paper published, Christopher Moore, Alan West, Dr. Albert Goodyear, a plethora of other authors on the platinum anomaly and the black matte layer and all that type of thing. So we go back to, what caused this great extinction around 12,900 years ago. Just in general, what are your thoughts on the platinum anomaly layer, on the black mat layer, and the seemingly decline of Clovis people?
I think if you have, first of all, if we had a truly representative array of radiocarbon dates on the extinctions of specific genera and species, we'd find that after 20,000 or so years ago, from the height of the last glacial maximum to the end of the Pleistocene, you've got extinctions going on specifically in certain areas that humans, in some cases, had absolutely nothing to do with, that involved insects or birds or God knows what. And in other cases, may have provided the final trip out the door for the last of their kind, dodo-like, Mauritius type stuff. But I think we have somehow chosen to. We seem to be compelled to try to explain things we don't necessarily have enough information to explain. And so there's a tendency to seize on things, whether it's the platinum anomaly or some other kind of thing, as a possible explanation to a much more complicated problem that it can't be the only explanation to.
Right.
It's, again, using analogies to something far removed. I mean, like car racing or motorcycle racing or something like that. And you find these mechanics who will say, well, it's got to be this. And it's not that. It's probably 15 things.
Right.
But they'll seize on one thing and make it the solution to a very complicated problem. I'm not saying in this case that they're wrong, but there's probably a lot more going on than that.
For sure. Yeah. I think that's the same conclusion that we came to.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've been saying lately.
Yeah. Meadowcroft tends to be a legacy type of find and project that you would work on. Is there anything that you haven't yet accomplished in your career that you're still striving for? Is there still that pie in the sky that you're reaching for?
No, I mean, when we started here, it was, as you've heard or written or read, it was initially a field school experience to teach students, albeit under trying circumstances, the protocols of contemporary archaeology and geology and botany and a bunch of other stuff. But we never approached it as a goal, so to speak, beyond the methodological implications of it. I don't think I've ever had a goal in the sense that you're talking about, so that I think making people aware of not what we've learned, but how we've learned it, is probably more important to me than any substantive result, whether it's a cool piece of string from Vero or whatever. Mm-hmm. It's how we found and documented that piece of string that's more important to me than the piece of string, frankly. I think the reaction that people have when they visited the Vero excavation or Meadowcroft, when professionals say, I didn't even know you could do this stuff, that's both sad on the one hand and challenging on the other, because you want more people to understand how to do this stuff, at least in our version of what the right way is.
Right.
I think that's the whole thing. And this kind of thing provides one mechanism for doing that. In other words, I assume this reaches or potentially will reach people who will think about, more than they would otherwise think about, how you do it. And as we've said about Meadowcroft, it's not the antiquity of the site, it's the thousands of years of interdigitation of people with a very subtly shifting environment and the ability to document those interdigitations through time, that it's more important to us than however old it is. That it was old was icing on a cake we never wanted to bake. But we did want to tell people how to bake that kind of cake.
That trip up there to Pennsylvania Meadowcroft Rockshelter is one I will definitely remember for the rest of my life. Everyone was extremely accommodating, and most of all, just greatly appreciate Dr. Adovasio taking that time to speak with us. He had a lecture. It was over an hour long. We went down and did the tour, came back, and then he still gave us another 35, 40 minutes of his time at the end of the day as they were literally locking the place up and taking the money out of the gift shop register. We were still there spending time with Dr. Adovasio. So what an experience.
Yeah, that really was a great experience. I'd never been to any place like that before. And honestly, I didn't really know that much about Dr. Adovasio before we went up there. And, he gave the presentation. And then when we sat down with him to do the interview, one of the things he's an impressive guy. And during the interview, his manner of speaking is, he knows what he wants to say. And he just says it, and he's really smooth, and you can tell the guy's super smart. But I came away, the impression I had of the guy was he was like the Magnum PI or the Sean Connery of archaeology,
Oh, he is. In fact, I think that Heather, the curator there, archaeologist on site at the Grave Creek Mound that we spoke with, she joked, she said, we call him the Sean Connery of archaeology. He is very much that. I didn't know exactly what to expect on our way up there, and we're riding out through the beautiful Pennsylvania country, and we were kind of joking around and everything, about, oh man, I bet he's like this, I bet he drives this kind of a car. He pretty much exceeded every expectation, but especially in terms of generosity, because I thought maybe we'd have 10 minutes to sit down and talk with him, that he spent so much time, that he touched on things like Göbekli Tepe, that he took so much time and so thoughtfully presented these ideas and did that in that context for this interview with us. And one of the things one of the huge takeaways for me from that interview is where we asked him about the role of the avocationalist archaeologist. And we got to talk about that for just a minute. This is an important term, not advocation, it's avocationalist. This is a dedicated amateur in the field of archaeology. And it's so important, I think, to understand what role those dedicated amateurs or people who are knowledgeable amateurs in this field, what traditionally they have contributed to this field. And Dr. Adovasio even said at one point, there are certain irredeemable, I think he said, PhD types that will have nothing to do with amateurs like that. But for Adovasio, I think he not only saw the importance of it in his own work, but I think he saw that in us, and even at one point says in the video that something like this, I presume it's going to reach more people. I hope that this interview, this podcast, also the video of the interview on our YouTube page for 7 Ages Research, I hope that this does reach people, and I hope that a few of you out there will come away from this discussion with a new appreciation for not only human arrival and origins and the workings of humanity on the North American continent in ancient times, but also the hard work, the diligence, the thought, the planning that has to go into excavation, because that's the way that science reveals these aspects of the ancient past and helps us move forward with knowledge of what happened long ago. Now, when it comes to things that happened a long time ago, history, archaeology, science, and culture are all themes that we love to discuss on this program. And so from time to time, we will feature short vignettes where we will pick a topic and we will focus on something, often in a somewhat humorous way. And so today's little history lesson, as we conclude here in the final minutes of the 7 Ages Audio Journal, will deal with the history of alcohol.
The history of alcohol.
All kidding aside, I have personally always been fascinated with this subject. I even used to have a blog called Culture of Spirits, where my co-author Christopher McCollum and we wrote historical articles about not only the creation of alcohol in ancient times, like we're about to get into, but also just, brewing culture today. We would talk about the formation and the creation of certain cocktails and things like that. And one thing I always meant to get into, but I never did, I've always intended to do this, was home brewing, which, James Waldo, I know you are a home brewer.
I am, and home brewing and alcohol in general is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, as you know. It's a great hobby. It's very satisfying, and you can make great beer with little expense, and impress your friends, and and have a drink. What's interesting about this though is the amount of time that people have been consuming alcohol. And there's an article here on the Washington Post that we saw recently, where the tradition looks like it goes back at least 8,000 years.
Yeah, early winemaking. And what's so cool about this is there are a lot of questions that can be raised about what role it played. First, the actual report, as the Washington Post describes at the next holiday dinner, they say when the discussion turns to politics and you reach for a second glass of Merlot, consider this: your social lubricant has 8,000-year-old roots. People were fermenting grapes and storing wine in massive jugs as long ago as 6,000 BC, according to a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But what's so interesting about this is there are theories about what role alcohol played in ancient times, too. Did the consumption of alcohol and its discovery, in fact, influence certain progressive elements and periods in ancient history? Again, they refer to it there as a social lubricant, so the question is, what role did alcohol play in the formation of early civilization and things like this?
Well, according to Patrick McGovern, who is the author and expert in ancient wines at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, who's responsible for this new study, to quote him, he says that wine flows through the ancient Georgians' culture. They drank wine to celebrate births. They left wine cups and pitchers in tombs. And as we all know that in ancient Egypt, wine was very important to the pharaohs and kings. Beer, wine, all sorts of alcoholic beverages were consumed in ancient Egypt. And again, according to McGovern, he says, quote, it became economically important just like the wine culture in California and Oregon. Once these fermented beverages take hold of a society, they tend to become the heart of the society. And so there we definitely see an influence, and if nothing else, we can also see not only the earliest example of wine, but also possibly the earliest example of it becoming a central part of society and an economically viable influence.
Jason, that's kind of funny, that part you said about how it becomes the center of society. That made me think of the more things change, the more they stay the same. People have always kind of been, love their alcohol, I guess you could say. When I was reading this story, I started to wonder, because I make beer, and it's not too complicated of a process, but I thought, well, how did they make wine? How did they figure it out, years ago, back in history? So really, basically what it amounted to for the ancient winemaking is they just crushed grapes and collected the grape juice and put it in a container and let it ferment on its own for a couple of weeks or 30 days, and it basically becomes wine. If you let it set too long, it becomes vinegar. Of course, winemaking has become more sophisticated over the years, but in its purest form, that's really how they did it.
I don't know if you guys saw, I put in the 7 Ages chat this morning a video that takes us back to the time of the Clovis hunters and a hypothetical discovery of wine. Did you guys see that video by chance?
I did not.
I'll give you the Reader's Digest version here. So 2 Paleo-Indian hunters are sitting together on a stump, and one of them has like a little, kind of like a bark bowl full of berries. And they're both complaining about how they'd really like to have some mastodon. And then they hear the mastodon off, camera. And so they throw down the cup of berries and leave it sitting on this stump and go off in pursuit of the mammoth. And then it shows a few days later they come back and, oh, look, berries. And one of the guys picks up his berries, but having sat out in the rain and the sun, and they'd just been sitting there, of course, the berries are now essentially just a fermented juice. And he picks it up and he drinks it, and then they talk about how they have to take it back and show it to everybody else. But I can't help but wonder if in the truest form, that's probably not kind of how it happened. I mean, that something was left sitting out for several days. Somebody comes back around and they're like, whoa, what's this? But one brave soul tries it and not only notices that it has a nice flavor, but also that it gets you a little happy when you drink it. In fact, the ancient Persians who first distilled alcohol, they actually believed that a spirit entered you when you consumed it. And so that Persian word al-ghul is a reference to the ghost or the spirit that comes into one and moves them, so to speak, and induces the drunkenness when alcohol is consumed. And of course, that's part of the reason that we gather together here in the Space-Time Pub. We pour a glass, we pull up a chair, and we share good conversation in the company of friends about our fascination with the past and the knowledge we hope to gain in the future.
You know, guys, I've had a pretty good time here today talking about this stuff, but I'm getting awfully thirsty. What do you say? Let's go get something to drink here at the bar.
I'll be right behind you.
Well, save a glass for me. And for those of you listening at home, be sure and head over to 7ages.org. You can find links to all of our social media accounts, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll catch you again in the future, or maybe in the past, on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.